Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen. Today's guest in episode 26 is Sarah Ferguson. Last year, ABC Television screened her three-part documentary series The Killing Season, which examined the forces that shaped the Australian Labor Party during the recent years in which Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard led the party and the nation. Based on Sarah's lengthy and insightful interviews with key political players, and filmed with the drama and style of the Netflix series House of Cards, it was pitch-perfect television that resonated strongly across the country, attracting around 1 million viewers each episode. The series further established Sarah's position as one of Australia's finest television interviewers and presenters. Since 2008, she has worked as an award-winning investigative journalist on current affairs program Four Corners, which she currently hosts, as well as filling in for Leigh Sales as the host of 7:30 in 2014, and conducting several hard-hitting political interviews during that time. In 2016, Sarah became an author with The Killing Season Uncut, co-written with series researcher Patricia Drum, and published in April by Melbourne University Press. Sarah's book goes behind the scenes to candidly reveal the stories behind the interviews with Rudd, Gillard, and a host of other key players. I found that her asides into the craft of journalism were a highlight of the book, such as this quote: "The business of persuasion is a fraught one for journalists. Persuasiveness is one thing, bullshit is another. You have to understand your subject intimately and what their purpose is in speaking on camera. I prefer candor, but it's not enough by itself. And you are not friends, although it can appear that way. The line you shouldn't cross is usually only visible when it's behind you." End quote. When Sarah was on a day trip to Brisbane in early May, we met at her inner-city hotel room so that I could ask her a few questions before she had to dash off to a radio interview across town. It was a thrill to be sitting across from one of the country's most formidable journalistic brains. Within a few minutes, she had called me out for incorrectly attributing a quote from the book to her rather than Julia Gillard. Our conversation touches on how her writing style has developed across her career, her early writing influences including her love of poetry, how she comes up with ideas for her Four Corners stories, why she posted a Julia Gillard quote above her desk, who she turns to when she's having trouble with a story, and how she decided to open a live budget night interview on 7:30 with a particularly devastating question for then Treasurer Joe Hockey. Introducing Sarah Ferguson, journalist and author. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You're on the book tour. Tell me, how have you spent your morning?
I had a conversation with Richard Fidler at the ABC, but before that I admired the ABC building at South Bank because I've come from Sydney and it's starting to get cold and it still looked summery and the flowers were in bloom and the sky was blue, so my heart was restored by that sight.
How is Richard Fidler?
Excellent. He's a thoughtful man who asks very good questions.
He does indeed. I think the two of you are among the top interviewers in the country, so it was a good match.
There's a lot of very good interviews in this country. We've got a lot of game in Australia.
So the book has come out recently. I absorbed it in a single day on Friday. I loved it.
I like that.
Having absorbed the series, of course, when it came out week by week last year. What are the origins of the book? Was it always intended to be followed up by a book? No,
it wasn't. The head of Melbourne University Press, Louise Adler, who is a ferociously smart, energetic woman who sees projects from a long way off, and she was very keen on us doing this. But at the time of the series itself was so overwhelming that in terms of the time and the demands, that there was no way we could do something in parallel or at the same time. But she persisted, and so I had to go away and make another. I went away to make another series. So really the conditions for writing it were perfect, so she was happy for that, or was Melbourne University Press were okay with that delay. But the greatest thing about that was the one thing you never get in television is time to step back and review, and so that opportunity to have had a few months pass in between to then go back to the material and look at it and think about it again was that was a real pleasure and an opportunity I never get.
In the book's acknowledgements, you say of Louise Adler, she's the source of all the best ideas. Did it take some convincing for you to...
Not really, because we love the material. So this, of course, this is extraordinarily rich material because you've got these two great careers that have been cut off, if you like. So it's an unfinished story, unlike the stories, say, of Bob Hawke and John Howard. They both did big series for the ABC, but they may not have willingly ended their political careers, but they were ended, whereas these two were ended prematurely by each other. And so I think that the story is unfinished. I think people's understanding of the story is incomplete, and it was the same for me. And to see these two characters come together and then tear each other down gives it, I think, an endless human fascination. So for me, going back and writing about it was a pleasure because the material itself is so rich. And there was a lot of material that we couldn't put in the series, which is, the book is partly that and partly the experience of making it.
Why wasn't ABC Books the publisher?
How did that work? Melbourne University Press are extraordinary. They're a small publishing house, and they are extraordinarily energetic. So we could have done it with ABC Books, but Louise Adler pushed hard, pushed early, pushed longest, and she was there at the moment when it was possible, and she was the one standing in front of me at that moment.
You have co-author on the book, Patricia Drum. Help me understand how you divvied up the tasks.
How that worked.
Yeah.
So what Trish had worked on the series, so we had this fabulous relationship that it had been going for a long time, which was the great debate over the series. So we were always, in the making of the series, moving between each side, sometimes swinging wildly between different versions. And Trish has a fine mind, and so that debate over who was right and who was wrong and who was trying to manipulate the material or manipulate the story was a rich and unending debate within the project, within the production team at the time. And so coming back to it, we continued that discussion, continued the style of that debate, which is a really rigorous debate around the facts of each event. So what Trish did, because I was making a series on domestic violence for the ABC, Trish went ahead and went back into the voluminous transcripts and started pulling out the crucial material, and then we would debate what we kept and what we discarded.
What was the word count roughly on those transcripts? Because you had something like 45 people interviewed.
I don't know what the word count is. I think it's 54. I think it's 54 interviews, of which 51 were used, which is a good ratio.
Yeah.
And I think it's 100 all up. There were some research interviews, pre-interviews done. I think it's 110 hours or more of on-camera interviews. I don't know what the word count is. It would be enormous.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of material. And of course, if you're making a series, it's 7 years, 2006 to 2013, over 5 hours or 4.5 hours, 3 episodes. So a lot doesn't get in.
Did you enjoy writing the book?
I loved it, and I haven't written a book before, so I was unprepared for how much I enjoyed it. I did do it quickly, in the sense that we needed to master that material fast and get the book written. So it was hard work, but it was very rewarding work, and it just enabled me to look at material in a completely different way to the way I look at material for television, because television necessarily has its constraints of delivery and performance and how the drama, because this was a dramatic story, and so you needed dramatic or strong, what we call in television grabs, as you know, grabs that move the narrative forward, and it's a particular type of energy, not necessarily always the same energy, but you need an emotional strength, and if that falls away, the grab doesn't work, or it's someone who lacks that energy, sometimes those grabs won't work. Of course, for a book, you're unconstrained by performance, so it opened up a whole area of material that we hadn't used in the series.
How much work did you and Patricia do on the structure of the book? Was it a long conversation, or it was kind of apparent?
No, I think that was apparent because we decided to stick largely with the real question was around the omissions, because we decided to stick with the narrative. The first thing was the prologue, which obviously is out of order because it's a scene with Rudd that occurs during the interviews, but we placed that at the beginning because it was such a memorable moment, which is Kevin Rudd deciding that he's not coming back in for the rest of the interviews, that he's going to stop right there. So it was a very dramatic moment where the series hung in the balance. Apart from that, we followed the narrative of we just followed the narrative of the time.
You wrote towards the beginning, for me, there's always a bit of an intake of breath going out and doing media. You've certainly done a lot of media.
That's Julia Gillard, not me.
Oh, indeed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well picked up. I sense the same thing from you, though, because you were profiled recently in Good Weekend magazine by Stephanie Wood.
Yes.
How did you find that process?
Awful. So I like doing media about the work I do. I dislike it intensely when it's about me. So she had a tough job and she did very well in the circumstances. But given that it's not something that I like doing.
You want the work to stand for itself.
Yeah. And, it's not about... None of it's about me. It's all about the people. So I'm just a distraction.
There wasn't the slightest thrill you experienced seeing that great cover photo of yourself leaning back in a chair?
Relief would be the highest point you would get to.
Right. Thank you for catching me on Julia Gillard. That's very astute of you.
Not really. I know that material like the back of my hand.
I'm not surprised. You had one of Julia Gillard's lines above your desk for quite a while. Tell us what that line was and why it resonated.
It's an interesting thing because it's not so much that it was a devastating line, but it was a Latin tag that she'd used in a riposte to Malcolm Turnbull, and the Latin translates as "only endure." And I think Gillard taught herself over years to endure and to endure well. It's a posture that she often takes to the world, and I watched her in Parliament in those years. I didn't know her at all. I'd never met her, but I watched her perform brilliantly in Parliament during her years in opposition. Very few people can dominate the chamber, and she's one of them. And I think it's particularly difficult for a woman because a man's voice resonates around that chamber probably more easily than the timbre of most women's voices. But she could do it. She could really use her personality and her communication skills to dominate. But that line came from a very cheeky riposte to Malcolm Turnbull because she was very funny in Parliament. And some of those features were the features that we saw less of when she was Prime Minister. Necessarily, it's a very serious job, but it's. I've talked about this. If people are interested in this, to try and understand, and I don't have the answer. The gap between it's the real Julia and the Julia that makes the media performances.
Why did that resonate with you? Only endure.
I like the idea of endurance. I like the idea that you get through things, and. It's probably it probably has and I don't mean this religiously, but it probably has a culturally Protestant, it's a culturally Protestant root of mine that where endurance is something to be admired.
Mm-hmm. I certainly admire your endurance and your interviewing abilities. It's actually quite formidable to be sitting across from you, Sarah, I must say. This podcast is about writing, not politics. Mm-hmm. I've heard a lot of the interviews you've done around this book, and they're mostly about Brad Gillard, and I'm sensing that you might be tired of going over and over those entrails. So this interview, let's concentrate on story and writing.
Yes.
You are the current presenter, host of Four Corners, but you're also a reporter. How important is writing to the storytelling process for television?
Beautiful question. It is essential. Now, it can sometimes end up being a very pared back element, so it would appear to have a small element, but it's crucial. You look at an overwritten story where the words either fight with or don't know how to use the pictures, and it's a much less satisfying experience. You don't necessarily always know as a member of the audience what's happening. You know when you're in the hands of a great writer, and television writing is a particular skill, and I'm not suggesting I'm a great writer, but I've learned some techniques from people over the years. Using, capturing the story, capturing the narrative, and using words to bring out the beauty of the dynamics, the human dynamics that you're looking at, and the visual scene in front of you is a real skill. And when it's done skillfully, it's done with economy. So if you look at it, if I was to show you a page of a good script, it would have not many words on it. If I show you the page of a poorly written script, it'll have lots and lots of words. Less is more in television writing, but also it's about synthesis. It's about trying with each sentence to get to the heart of the matter, not overloading each paragraph with too much information so that you allow the pictures to do their work, but always moving the narrative along so that the narrative is never still, that each paragraph has a role. Not too many roles, it doesn't try to do too many things, but it's always moving the story along. Was that a hard lesson to learn? It's a skill, but you only have to see it done well to see how brilliant it is. And people evolve their own style, so mine has become, it is very pared back, it's quite clipped at times, it is minimal. That's just my style now. So I was overloaded when I was sort of first starting out as a journalist, I was unfortunately influenced by Gertrude Stein, not because she's not a great writer, but because she's got such an affected style, and I allowed it to. It did actually, a bad secondhand Gertrude Stein ain't nothing no one wants to hear. So it was my writing was a bit polluted early on, and it was probably a bit pretentious. So I think all of that's gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, you gave a presentation at Storyology a few years ago on this topic, on the topic of telling stories, and you said as much, using too many words is telling a story improperly, or not telling a story properly. How do you know when a story is done, or when you've got the words right?
Every now and again you get a moment where the words and the pictures go together in perfect harmony, and you don't achieve many in a story, but often because television is written to very intense deadlines, you just have to accept that where you are is where it's going to be, and it's as close to perfect, but often you'll fall somewhat short. Just every now and again you get a piece of harmony between the words and the pictures that where the two things have come together perfectly, and that's a lovely feeling.
I wonder whether that sparseness that you now have in your writing is influenced by your love of poetry.
Yes, it is. I mean, I think everything I do with words is influenced by my love of poetry, and I think rhythm enters into that because that's the other thing. And clearly, if you're writing a 70-minute script, you need rhythm. You need to get the rhythm right. You need the movements to be rhythmically correct, and that's quite a hard thing to know. And I used to put far too much into stories. When I go back and look at old stories, they're a little bit too crowded, and now I say less, do less, try and achieve less in a way, achieve more by doing less. There's a moment, let me give you an example of words. This is by no means, I'm not saying this is an example of great writing, but it's just a moment where the beautiful filmmaking and the beautiful editing and just a sentence create a real mood. So in the first episode of The Killing Season, at a certain point we're moving into the period where Malcolm Turnbull is going to Malcolm Turnbull is the leader. He's taken over the leadership of the Liberal Party. It's in the lead up between winter of 2009 and Copenhagen, when Tony Abbott takes over just before Kevin Rudd goes to Copenhagen. It's after the global financial crisis. It's a big turning point in the episode. So we've been through, Rudd and Gillard have met, they've defeated Kim Beazley, we've had the global financial crisis, which is a very energetically told series of sequences, beautifully filmed in New York, very with some quite beautiful, strange images. But the rhythm is fast, and we were cutting very, very fast in this episode. I think our cut count would be, each episode contains more shots than most movies, so it's a very fast-paced program. So when we get to winter and we're going into the Godwin Gretsch saga with Malcolm Turnbull, we need to slow down the pace. We need to turn a corner. We need to signal that we're changing subject and we're going somewhere else. And it was winter, and it was the winter session of Parliament, and we had this series of incredibly beautiful images of frost on Parliament House and the crows, and married with an archive shot of Malcolm Turnbull walking across the forecourt of Parliament House in a big overcoat with his breath, blowing his breath, and the line for that. So we have a few shots, and then the voiceover line is just "Winter crept over the capital," and it just stops the rhythm, slows it down, and signals that you're going from one place to another. And just in that moment, it's not an exceptionally clever or anything line. It's a perfectly nice line, but with the pictures put together, it just does its television job. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you about when you were the host at 7:30 for 6 months in 2014. You had some highly memorable interviews with political leaders during that time. I want to ask specifically about a question that relates to today. I think it was budget night with Joe Hockey, the then Treasurer, and your opening question to him was, is it liberating for a politician to decide election promises don't matter? How much work did you put into the specific wording of that question?
Well, it was obviously going to be an important issue in that budget. So the idea was swirling around in my head, and I'd not precisely, but I'd been talking about it in the lead up. And when we got into the lockup and realised what was exactly what my colleagues in Canberra are doing today, which is pouring through the budget papers and looking for the narrative. And it became clear in the course of that afternoon that the narrative was, as we had, it had been leaked out somewhat what was coming, and the narrative was going to be this huge contest of ideas where promises had been broken. And what happened is I was sitting in the lockup working on my questions, and at the end of the lockup, because the 7:30 interview is the first interview, you have to get yourself to the front of the very large crowd of journalists who are pouring out of the lockup in order to file as fast as they can. But the ABC people have to get out and up to the ABC studios where they wait for the Treasurer. So I was got myself to the front, and I had a large pile of budget papers, and sitting on top of the budget papers was my laptop with the screen open, and Catherine Murphy, who's a fantastic writer from The Guardian, was standing next to me, and I put it over towards her and said, what do you think? Do you think that's okay? And she just nodded and gave a big Catherine Murphy grin, and the doors opened, and I ran very fast up the stairs, flew up to 7:30, flew into the studio, a little bit of powder, sit down, pant.
And then hit him with that question,
which
is devastating. Like, you can just see the physical reaction. It takes him a while to process what you just
Every now and
with.
again in a studio, it's good. It's not the only way. There are lots of different ways of doing interviews, but every now and again it's good to mark out your territory and just say, you're in my zone. You're here to answer questions on behalf of the audience. You're not here just to deliver a speech. And that the point of that question was to take us right to the heart of what that budget was about.
Mm-hmm. We're jumping all over the place here because you have a very limited amount of time. What's your ideas process for a Four Corners story?
It varies a lot. In a perfect world, it's a great story because stories are much easier to tell. Stories work for television. A good, strong narrative. I could start telling a narrative story on the back of an envelope. So a story without a narrative is a much harder thing to construct. So what you ideally want is something with a beginning, a middle and an end, and in a perfect world, TikTok, where there's a countdown to an event so you can build up drama. We steal techniques in the writing of programs from every form of television, from top-end documentary, particularly from drama, where you're constantly building up the drama but not delivering it, and then you take it up to the next and up to the next. So the perfect story to write for television is an event where something's happened, where you have a lot of people who are going to be suddenly like an incident on a plane, for example, something where you're going to have a crash, or it sounds like I like terrible things, but where you've got an event where you've got people coming from different places whose destinies collide and end up involved in a story, but where there is a countdown. That's a perfect story because it sort of writes itself.
What's an ideal day when you're reporting a Four Corners story? An
ideal day is when you turn up at a supermarket at 6 o'clock in the morning waiting for a people smuggler to turn up, and he turns up and you get him. That's an ideal day because a lot of work goes into that stuff, and there are very few moments where you get exactly what you're looking for. It's rare, so that's an ideal day. Or it's just a day spent in a somewhere where the either you have a rich engagement with someone in a conversation or an interview, or you're filming something so dazzling, and that may mean beautiful or exquisitely ugly, where something but rich and intense happens. So it's the visual and the interviews, and sometimes it is the I gotcha.
What's your reading diet like? Do you have like a set number of publications that you just love and return to regularly?
I do. Look, it's really messy, and it sort of goes up and down, and fits and starts, and healthy and unhealthy. So I do have when in these periods when work is very intense, I do have books to which I return frequently that I can read as if visiting old friends. Sometimes you need to be taken on a new adventure, and sometimes it's good just to go back and hang out with old friends and how they behave. And
which ones are you thinking of?
So the books to which I return most frequently are the Aubrey Maturin series by Patrick O'Brien. I don't know if you've read them.
I do not know.
Uh-huh.
Context?
To the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, an intelligence officer, an intelligence agent and a sea captain, but it's sort of Jane Austen at sea, exquisitely, brilliantly, beautifully written, great stories, two intensely appealing characters and their interaction. So those books I've read and reread. Ford Madox Ford, The Good Soldier, is a book to which I return frequently. It was probably one of my favourite books of all time. No, definitely in my top 3, I would think. I used to reread Jane Austen a lot. I actually haven't read Jane Austen for a while, so I'm a little out of habit. I returned to a book of parliamentary sketches written by a British sketch writer called Simon Hoggart, who's brilliantly funny. That's, again, a book to which I can return frequently. Mm-hmm. I've read Frank Morehouse's trilogy more than once, so he's someone I can go back to. Charles McCarry, I mean, these are in the kind of the really enjoyable, who I'm not going to say non-stretching because they're great books. Charles McCarry, who's a British spy writer, great character, called Christopher, who is a little bit like the Stephen Maturin character in the Aubrey Maturin novels. Aloof, brilliant, a poetry writer, but a series of stories that covers the Cold War and then goes back to the Second World War. So those are my very close friends who I can go back to whenever I like.
Very good. Who or what do you turn to if you're having trouble with a story or feeling self-doubt?
Or feeling what?
Self-doubt.
Self-doubt. If I'm having trouble with a story, I'd talk to Tony, my husband, because he's a brilliant storyteller, and he can solve the structure of any story that's got a problem. Or my the producer on this story, Dead Masters on the Killing Season, who again is someone with whom I have a fantastic language, which is just an enormous working privilege to have someone where you understand each other's visual and written language so well that we don't need to finish each other's sentences. When we were making The Killing Season, we were moving very fast, particularly towards the back end, and I regret that we didn't film ourselves just to have a little snatch of it, because I know what we were doing. People would walk in and look puzzled because we were speaking in fractions of sentences, but we knew exactly what we were. Wow. We knew what we were saying. So we've worked out a way of working together where we can work our way through material, disagree, but always in a way that's leading to a better outcome, which is, you catch that, you don't let go of it.
That's a rare relationship to have.
It's a rare relationship to have.
And it's interesting you mentioned Tony, because in that Stephanie Wood profile for Good Weekend of you, she mentioned, she quoted Tony saying, "No one else could have told the story as well as you did in The Killing Season."
Well, he could. He could. He's a brilliant television writer.
Mm-hmm. What's your favourite part of your job, Sarah?
Oof. It's favourite part. In some ways it's the in some ways it's setting off on when a story is commissioned, because then anything is possible. Packing up and leaving and getting on the plane, I really like long distance plane flights at the beginning of a story, or at least a decent flight where you can really let your mind cut loose. I like that. I like the poetry of the air, that ability to let the mind really roam free.
Will you tend to take notes by hand then, or with typing on a computer, or both?
More likely by hand, but sometimes we might, if Deb and I would be on a plane together, we might get the computer out and have some ideas, but we'd just be sitting there kind of going through the story and talking it over. But it's just the freewheeling nature of being in the air.
Is it kind of like storyboarding an ideal story, how it will ideally go?
So we do that that's a much more kind of structured process, and we do that we wouldn't do that on a plane, but we do that to work out shooting scripts and nail as much as you can before you go, and then wait for all the surprises and the disasters to overtake you, as they invariably will.
Hardest part of the job?
Hardest part of the job. Well, the banal answer is, the dull answer is all related to time, that you never have enough time and you feel time slipping away and you don't think you can get far enough, and that there's a whole series of layers of truth out of reach. That's hard because you know that you've only got a certain amount of time and you won't reach those layers. And otherwise it's the disappointments of it's probably just not cracking the story as much. But it's probably time. Most things come back to time.
Indeed, which we are on a short timeline here ourselves. I've got 5 minutes until we have to finish by
Two,
my watch.
I'll give you... okay, right. Hang
If
on,
that's
let me
okay.
just- yes,
I'm
that's
on
fine. Keep
3:05.
going. Okay.
Sorry, I'm not trying to
No, you're good.
shortchange you here.
Our clock is wrong, isn't it?
Yes. Have you developed any habits throughout your career that you think have greatly enhanced your ability to ask the right questions at the right time, or anything that comes to mind?
Well, listening is the most important thing of all. Preparation, that's a sort of very conchy thing to say, but preparation is key to everything, and I can see your preparation is very good.
Thank you.
Preparation is key, and then listening. As you listen, you can, as people are formulating their questions, you can hear before they get to the finished question. You can understand so much about where they're headed and who they are as they ask the question. So listening really closely.
Do you remember the last line of your book?
I hadn't asked all the questions I wanted to, but I think I'd asked enough.
Almost exactly right, and that's how I feel. Thank you so much for joining me, Sarah.
Very good questions.
Thanks for listening to Penmanship, and thank you to my guest, Sarah Ferguson. You can find show notes to this episode and all previous episodes at penmanshippodcast.com. I welcome your feedback, criticism, suggestions for future guests. My email is andrew@penmanshippodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to rate it on iTunes or Stitcher or your podcatcher of choice, and share it on social media with people in your life who love great Australian writing. You can find the show on Twitter @penmanshipau and on Facebook. The theme music, as ever, is Eternally Yours by Laughing Clowns. That's it for now. Until next time.